Good morning. Once again, we still have a few guests in the room. I will kindly ask you to rename yourself if you don't mind, so we know who is in the room. And also, if you like to activate your camera so that it feels more like a cozy conversation. But if you actually don't like to, that's no problem, of course. Thanks for joining this event. My name is Elisa, Vice President of the LLLP and Coordinator for Education and Lifelong Learning in Solidar Foundation, and I have the pleasure to moderate this morning panel and event on commodifying assessment through, commodification of education and the links between the commodification of education and assessment and well-being, which is the overarching theme of this LLL week. We are going to discuss this based on the basis of the policy paper that Solidar Foundation has recently released on the commodification of education, which my colleague Andre will present later on. And also we will frame this conversation, of course, within the LLL week, and we will do so thanks to the introductory remarks of Giuseppina Tucci, President of the LLLP, from whom you will hear in a second, but also thanks to the remarks of Tomasz Grikchan. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Tomasz. Tomasz is coordinator for social dialogue, economic policy and governance at the European Trade Union Committee for Education, as well as thanks to the remarks by Matteo Vespa, working at the European Students' Union. So thank you once again. I will now give the floor to Pina without further ado, and then we'll explain how we're gonna discuss all of this together. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elisa, and thank you everyone for joining this fantastic event in the framework of the Lifelong Learning Week. As Elisa pointed out, this week is the 11th edition of the Lifelong Learning Week, and it is dedicated to rethinking assessment, prioritizing learners' well-being, which is also the title of the policy recommendations and the position paper that we have produced this year at the Lifelong Learning Platform, and that I'm going to try to briefly touch upon into framing this. I have to say, I don't want to spoil the presentation by Andre because I'm sure it will be extremely interesting, but there are extremely many points where are the recommendations of the position paper of the Lifelong Learning Platform and the one that Solidar just released bridge, and so I will really try not to make any spoilers, but I think I will at some point. I've said it many times this week, and I think it became a sort of a mantra, how it is true that evaluation and assessment has always been and has become in the recent year more and more of a tool to reinforce a new vision of education and of lifelong learning, which is very much that of education as an industry that needs to create profit, that needs to feed skilled labor force into the labor market, and that needs to be ranked very hardly so that we can fit everything in a box and continue and perpetuate this narrative of assessment. And it is not only higher education that falls into this category, it is also secondary education, it is also non-formal education. We've seen a push towards more and more numeric indicators, more and more a continued push to assess also what in non-formal education we call evaluation, and we try to use different methods to evaluate the competencies that we develop as human beings. Now, of course, evaluation has proven to be a source of stress for students, but also for educators. And the reason why it is also very often a source of stress for educators is because their own job security and their own job assessment is linked to the performance of students. And so there is a sort of cycle of reproducing a certain dynamic of high performing, high achievement, and continuous pressure on educators that is extremely detrimental for the well-being of everyone that is part of the school community. We have several, I'm not saying that we have several solutions for this, but we do have some solutions. We have produced a set of recommendations. Some of them that I would like to highlight is that we would like to see education to be a catalyst for well-being. Schools at this time makes students, schools, but also anyway, any learning environment, make education can make students and learners sick, which is something that we do not believe should happen. At the same time, we also see, as I said, a continuous teach to test, teach to perform sort of narrative, and this is something that needs to be changed, and we need to align assessment and evaluation to more competence-oriented methodologies and more outcome-based approaches, so that we can consider the more holistic picture of what we learn throughout our different learning experiences, informal, non-formal, and informal learning. We also need to consider that assessment as it stands now, it is extremely inequitable. It does nothing but fostering inequalities, particularly pushing those learners that are already disadvantaged more at the margins. It does nothing but sharpening, for example, the inequalities of, for example, students and learners with disabilities, with a migrant background, as well as learners from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We need to rethink education and rethink assessment in a way that it is more inclusive, and that it takes into account the diversity of learners' needs. And last but not least, I think one of the most important claims of the position paper that also bridges a lot with what is said in Solidar's position paper is also the idea of strengthening the universal access to lifelong learning, and this cannot be done if not by introducing alternative policy making mechanisms to evaluate education and training. Of course, as I mentioned before, performance and results-based funding for education and training should not be the norm. It does endanger the very mission of lifelong learning and of access, and it does so because it is also part of a bigger picture of what we will discuss later on, commodifying education as a product that we need to purchase. And in this, there are several learning entitlements that we need to protect further from commodification, and we need to make sure that they are accessible for everyone. You said it very well in your paper, and I would like to just take a minute to for us to refocus this. Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity to redesign education systems and the way that we learn and assess, but we also need to be extremely careful of making it in a way that is sustainable and that is extremely long-term, that has a very long-term vision, and that can look far beyond the post-COVID-19 urgency, and that can look into, for example, continuous support of continuous commitment of a 10% of GDP in national budgets on education. There are several things that you propose that are extremely interesting to look at. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, and I don't want to steal any more of your time. So I'm going to close it here. Thanks again for organizing this event in the framework of the LLLWeek and for the very, very insightful report.
Thank you very much, Pina. And what we are going to do next, also to make this more of an interactive exercise in a way, is to hear from you as well. So we're going to open breakout rooms in which we hope you can, introduce yourself to each other and get acquainted with the other participants, but also discuss a couple of questions we prepared for you for the 10 minutes you're going to spend there. Ideally, Pina's introduction will also help sparking some thoughts in that conversation. And so what we're going to ask you to reflect upon during the breakout room is the two questions that I just posted in the chat. The first one is, what would be an ideal type of assessment for you and your organization, and why? And the second one is, how can your organization or your member organizations contribute to the debate on the nature of assessment? Later on, when we come back from the breakout rooms, we come back to the plenary, we will ask one person from each breakout room. I think we're going to have 2 breakout rooms to tell us about the 2 main takeaways from your discussion in the breakout rooms, so that then your takeaways can feed into the panelists' intervention that are going to follow. So I hope it's clear enough. If not, please feel free to raise your hand or ask a question in the chat to make sure everyone understood correctly what we're going to do. Hopefully it was clear enough, because I don't see any raised hand. So I think we will soon be ready to open the breakout rooms speakers will not intervene during the breakout rooms because we really want to hear from participants. So this is also for us from the back end in a way. If we are in the breakout rooms, do not take the floor. We will have plenty of time afterwards. Welcome back to the plenary to everyone. And thank you for participating in this exercise. I hope you enjoyed it. Personally, I always love breakout rooms for a lot of reasons, but especially because I get to know participants a bit better than what one could do if we would always stay in the plenary. So I hope most, if not all of you, had the opportunity to share your thoughts on the two questions that we had. And before moving on with the panel and with also explaining maybe a little what is the connection we believe existing between the commodification of education and assessment methods, as this was also a question in the breakout room I was part of. I would like to hear from the participants in the breakout rooms what are the main takeaways regarding the two questions that we had. So I hope you had the time and the opportunity to decide who's gonna do this for each breakout room. I was in room 2, so I don't know who was in room 1 and would like to share from there. Does it have to be long? Just a couple of minutes? I have an idea.
I assume we were room 1, and
yeah,
you know how it always works with reporting back. Usually we talk so much that we forget to assign somebody properly, and then it's best and easier if the facilitators help then with this. So I think we had a really cool conversation, and I can't wait to include this in my presentation, in the responses back, because we were discussing about the point of assessment. So we went very even philosophical about this, not that practical, and it's actually very useful to take a second and think about why do we do the assessment, to understand then how we design the assessment then for this purpose. And then this conversation flew further into thinking about formative then and summative assessments, and for what reason you would use one rather than the other. Maybe in the early years of the education, you would rely more on formative, less on standards, focusing more on the learning process rather than the learning outcomes. Whereas later on, if you look at a specific training for a specific profession where you need certain standards, Claudia offered the example of pilots. Of course, you wouldn't want to jump into a plane with a pilot that has only been engaged in formative assessments. So each has their own role, but it's important to take a second to reflect back always on the assessment and what's the point of it. And I think we just went through the first question because we had so much to talk about that.
Or we can use maybe the Q&A time afterwards to go over the second question or other questions that will pop up during the conversation maybe. And I think Rafaela will be our porte-parole.
Yes, so in group 2, we mainly discussed that, well, assessment needs to start with an initial assessment, of course. That the main point about it is to capture the development of a learner and the skills that they acquired. And we said that for many target groups, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, with low literacy and so on, narrative approaches might be the most effective. Bibliography, no, well, you know, when people, biographical approaches, that is what I mean to say, when people can tell a story on how they developed their skills, what it has led to, contributed to, and so on. But at the same time, at least from our perspective as a European association, we see that there is also a trend towards more quantification of assessment, that funding organizations want to get surveys, for example, where participants in learning programs tick boxes or just give quantitative information on how much they learned. and what they learned exactly, because this is how funding bodies would tell if the learning offer provides good quality. There is this discrepancy between what is really effective for the target group and what funding organizations want, apart from the fact, of course, that when you use a quantitative, a qualitative approach like biographical approaches, you need to put much more time into that as an organization than just asking people to fill in surveys.
Thank you very much, Rafaela and Andre as well. Although Andre, I must say you breached the rule of not taking an active role in the breakout room, but doesn't matter. Thank you for facilitating the report. And so we will ask the speakers taking the floor now in a minute to react on these inputs as well, if possible, integrating them in their presentations, either during the first round or afterwards, when and if they see it fit, of course. We hope this is also going to be some food for thought for later on when we have the Q&A time. And of course, participants are very welcome to drop more questions they may have during the debate as well in the chat. We'll be happy to take them from there, but also, as I said, happy to give you the floor directly during the Q&A. I'm going to give the floor to Andre in a second to illustrate the main outcomes of the policy paper on the commodification of education that we just released and how this connects from our perspective. But we're happy to hear from all participants about it. How does this connect to the topic of assessment and well-being? And before doing so, just because I didn't do so until now, I would like to just introduce very briefly Solidar work. So Solidar is a European network of progressive civil society organizations working to advance social justice through a just transition. And in particular, Solidar Foundation gathers the members of Solidar who works on education and lifelong learning, while other members work also and/or in international development cooperation and social inclusion more at large. So it could be also a question, and I think Andre is going to address this also during his presentation, why organizations working in the non-formal, informal learning realm rather than formal education sector should care that much about the commodification of education. So I leave this question open for Andre to address it, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. And if I didn't have any second in the breakout room, I've got plenty of time now, so this is actually good. I'm going to be sharing my screen. There we go. So my name is Andre, Education and Lifelong Learning Policy Officer in Solidar Foundation. And I would like to see how assessment is linked with the commodification of education. And actually, a lot has been spoiled in the breakout rooms, but also by Giuseppina. And to be honest, I am very happy because I think it's a narrative that has been created around what education is supposed to be, why do we educate people, what for, also in terms of funding and public investment in these processes and austerity. There's mechanisms, there's a certain narrative that these are ways to go forward. And I think it's because so many people spoiled that narrative and repeated it constantly. So it's time to spoil now the other side of the narrative and talk a bit more about actually what education should be about. So what we did was then to have a policy paper on this topic. And I will present briefly the policy paper and then link it more with the situation of assessment. And we've been prompted actually to write this because there's been many public officials mentioning a return back to normal as the end goal of the post-pandemic world. And when thinking of education and what our members, which are informal and non-formal education providers, as Elisa said, experienced during the pandemic, we became worried of what this actually meant, because there have been decades of privatization and marketization in education that were exacerbated during the pandemic. And more of this will just be ushered in the next years. So we started from formal education to research this because this is mainly what is where the commodification then started. But then impacts over there have exacerbate inequalities in general outside of formal education as well. So there's many disadvantaged learners that are impacted by this process. And then in comes the informal and non-formal education providers that have to support these learners. So for this reason, it matters to us. And also for the fact that universal access to quality education should be, we are striving for this. Everybody should have this. And the way we've done the research was to run desk research, of course, but also to run focus groups with members and partners. And we actually have in the audience some of the members that have contributed to this. So I'm very happy they join us. And then the paper might appear a bit technical at times because we take some terminology out of research done by Stephen Ball and Deborah Udall. They are highly influential on the topic of privatization in education, starting to write as of 2008, and they continued in the decade after to work on this topic. And they distinguish between endogenous and exogenous privatization, where the first one is a certain kind of transfer of business-like practices into education. So basically, learners become consumers and educators become technicians that provide a service. But also it means that education institutions start competing with each other. And there we talk about these quantitative benchmarks that we've been talking about until now to assess their success. On the other side, exogenous privatization is more about private actors actually delivering a certain service for education. So it used to be catering, transport, cleaning, but now it moves into design of educational materials, design of assessment templates, design of curricula, and then this has implications on how education looks like then. By marketization, we refer to the exposure of a certain industry. So then education in this case, or service, to market forces. So this is basically our big concepts, what we understand, and then based on this, the scope of our paper, of course, was larger than just assessment. But for the purpose of the LLLWeek, we wanted to link assessment because because assessment is just another way through which commodification is being reinforced. And this is because the education system right now, the premise is that it supports learners to adapt to our current society, to be successful. It ensures that we have an efficient usage of the resources that we put in education. And to us, this is not the premise that we should start from, but rather that education is about ensuring social mobility, ensuring that all have opportunities to fulfill themselves in life. Education shouldn't just feed labor market needs so that learners can fit into a mold designed by a certain sector or another at one specific time in history. So it should provide learners with needed tools to actively participate in society and to actually discover what they value, what they would like to pursue. And then, of course, employment comes as part of this. They would learn how to join the labor market as well if it's thought of it more holistically. So as a result, we wanted to propose an alternative model of governance and funding in education based on this, and I'll discuss later in this presentation about that. But to get back to the assessment side, I just wanted to pose a few misleading maybe questions so that we can see how we referred actually to our assessment in our paper. And it's important first to ask who designs the assessments then, and then for what purpose. And it's exactly what Gisela was mentioning in our breakout room about what's the point then of the assessment. Because one can quickly say it's national authorities that would design this, but our research also shows how tech companies started to propose assessment methods, to recommend AI to improve efficiency and artificial intelligence to improve efficiency of assessment. And they are the ones starting to talk about education for the purpose of preparing learners for the labor market. So then the goal of for-profit providers becomes clear. They would want to design assessment in a way that they can find the top performers across large numbers of learners. Simple as that. But then also what is such an assessment then causing to many of the learners? Because what do learners resort to because of this type of assessment? And one of our examples from our policy paper is private tutoring. many have to resort to this because the pressure of the examinations is so high, and learners feel that formal education cannot cover this, that they actually have to pay extra on something that should be a universal right. And then they would also lose time for other types of learning because they engage into this private tutoring focused only on learning for the test. And then usually the form of this, the assessment that we usually refer to then when preparing these this policy paper and thinking about it was the standardized high stakes summative assessments, those final examinations, on which the future of learners' careers depends. They're designed in a way that would just provide comparable evidence across the learners so that they can be adequately divided into different career paths. And it's important to think to provide comparable evidence for the assessment, but is it only for the purpose of seeing where would one fit on the labor market, or should we start thinking about comparing something else across learners and their the competencies that they acquire? Because a system like this basically creates loops of improving education in the direction of preparing learners to solve tests quicker, or preparing learners to be quicker at following tasks, but it doesn't necessarily improve a holistic type of education. And the LLLP position paper that underpins this week actually does a literature review of how this assessment is impacting well-being, and then coming up with recommendations based on this. But they show how the anxiety of learners is negatively affecting their emotional development, which should be part of their learning, then their sense of self-worth. We're talking about 60% of students reporting stress regarding final examinations. So more than half of the student body being socialized into a culture of stress when they're not even close to joining the labor market. Like Claudia was mentioning that at the beginning of early stages in education, you in our breakout room, I mean, you're supposed to focus on the learning process rather than the learning outcomes. And who's actually affected by this format of assessment, who underperforms in this format? It's migrant learners, or it's disadvantaged socioeconomic background learners, because they don't have the material resources to step up their educational effort in this direction. They can't afford private tutoring, or they have been the ones that didn't have access to digital tools to continue learning during the pandemic. They might have had other household situations that did not provide an environment suitable for learning from home during the pandemic. So this type of assessment and this type of education is not necessarily ensuring social mobility and closing social cohesion gaps. It's actually widening them and affecting those disadvantaged more. And then our members tried their best during this time to reach these learners and close these gaps that formal education has not managed to cover. And they have been using innovative assessments, and we have examples from our membership in the position paper of the LLLP about various types of assessments that are not bound in the same way by formal, as is in formal education, by the national authorities to assess learners' labor market compliance, or other quantitative assessments types like this. But these providers, though they have been reaching those disadvantaged in society and have provided innovative ways to assess, they have been excluded from policymaking, from the implementation of education. And this is a missed opportunity, because education should be done in a lifelong and life-wide learning fashion. And it no longer fits only the summative assessment envisioned by a certain formal education model. So we need a new governance model and funding in education, one that can change then the aims of the education. Because if you change that, then you also change what's the point of education, and then you also change the assessments, because the assessments are simply there to promote the aims of the educational system. So we need an assessment that we need a new system that wants to assess the knowledge of the learners and help them develop holistically. So for this reason, in our policy paper, we propose to promote the whole school approach, to have the education system designed in a way that puts the learners at the center, while education stakeholders collaborate to deliver this type of education, this whole school type of education. We want to see formal, informal, and non-formal education providers collaborating, and education institutions should be in this system administered in a way that is democratic and transparent, because it's important to have the teachers, the parents, the learners, the civil society organizations, and other community stakeholders part of the governing boards of these institutions to be able to think about more than just labor market compliance or results so that you can rank higher as education institutions to catch more students. It needs to be a more holistic management process of this. And then, of course, this comes together with adequate public investment into education, because if you don't put that into it, there's you're always going to go back to the narrative of efficiency in education, cutting costs, and then cutting the holistic learning that we're talking about, basically, and just focusing on learning for the test. So we need to see 10% of the GDP offered to education, to a sector that is constantly talked about when we talk about the recovery from the pandemic or from other crises, but we don't provide sufficient attention then to this sector. And all of the stakeholders that we mentioned above before, it's just they have to be part of the policy making in education. They have the experience on the ground, and they should be able to share it in how education is being provided. And more recommendations are in our policy paper, but the ones that I mentioned here remain central to our conversation about considering how we should change the education system in such a way that then we can adapt also the assessment in a way that boosts well-being and the desire of learners to participate in learning and develop themselves. And thanks for listening to me, and I look forward to our other panelists and to our chat after. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andre. I hope this helped answering some of the questions that participants may have before joining this workshop, and that it will spark more questions maybe in a conversation afterwards. Next, I would like to turn to Tomasz, as indeed, like Andre explained, there is a clear connection, at least from my point of view, between mainstreamed assessment methods and the commodification of education. And I'm happy to see we have a very young new participant to this workshop, who is very welcomed. And Tomasz, ETUCE has been a great advocate against the commodification of education more at large. So we're going to talk more about the larger puzzle that Andre referred to, rather than the specific piece of assessment in it, like Andre put it in his presentation. So I would like you, Tomasz, to share with us the main takeaways and recommendations out of the long-standing work that ETUCE has been doing on this issue. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will just try to share my screen. Yes, hello again. My name is Tomasz Gryczan. So first of all, I would like to thank you for invitation for such an interesting panel discussion. And I need to stress that unfortunately I didn't have a chance to take a part on last ETUCE research linked to privatization in education. But despite this, I highlight in my presentation main issues which could be useful for participants in a further discussion. As introduction, first of all, I would like to stress that education, marketization, privatization, and commercialization may appear in multiple forms, including the contracting out of educational services and the transfer of costs to students who are increasingly treated as consumers rather than learners. The development of quasi-markets tying performance to rewards and sanctions, standardized mechanical measurement, and the increasing reliance on commercial and economic imperatives may come to expense of comprehensive and inclusive education and curricula. From ETUCE perspective, quality education has the primary purpose of developing each individual's potential and of laying of solid foundation for social just, democratic, and peaceful society. To do so, the principles underpinning education should be principles of fairness, equality, and quality. Education is also being considered crucial to increase productivity and innovation, leading to economic growth. However, since a decade, teaching professionals are dealing with the profound effects of the economic and financial crisis on young people and society, as well as their working condition and rights. After introduction, I would like to emphasize that the findings of ETUC research project of social dialogue and industrial relations in education, the challenges of multi-level governance and privatization in Europe, suggest that serious challenges lie ahead in terms of implementing the principles and the rights of the European pillar of social rights. And at that point, I think it is quite obvious that European Union has become an increasingly influential actor in shaping education and teacher policy. However, discrepancies between the rhetoric and realities of European Union governments do not create policy context for the promotion and reinforcement of social dialogue. Trends towards privatization risk to undermine the possibilities for social dialogue at all levels and disempower some of its actors. Fragmentation, individualization, and competition all pose serious challenges to social dialogue and collective bargaining. As you see, new public management reforms are reducing the role of trade unions and employers as economic and political actors. According to our research, privatization and education are negatively affecting teachers' professional autonomy, working conditions, salary, job security, and workload. Additionally, I would like to point out that from our perspective, public-private partnership are one of the forms of private involvement in the provision of education. ETUC is concerned by the promotion of EU-wide policy frameworks and new financial instruments, allowing and even encouraging private and public finance mix in education and training system. In our opinion, where employed private parties delivering public goods have not raised management standards and proven to be even more costly for public finances in longer term. The benefits and drawbacks of public-private partnerships should be critically assessed to ensure that European Union education system do not fall by the lobbying interest in an extremely competitive new market segment. Our research highlights that on one hand, the education sector and teacher workforce have been acknowledged as pivotal for sustainable economic recovery and growth, yet on the other, austerity initiatives have major repercussions for education system and teachers across Europe. Given the global trend toward liberalization and privatization of education sector, the question arises if the status of education as a public good is being undermined by the combination of reform, pressure, technocratic governance, budgetary constraints, and limited investments. Industrial relations and social dialogue are the heart of this process. According to our researchers, there is a widespread consensus that effective structures for the representation of teacher workforce in policy making, social dialogue, and collective bargaining between employers and employees are the fundamental factors for effective reform and quality education. In the wake of economic crisis and austerity measures, European institutions have come to acknowledge that social dialogue needs to be prioritized to counter the disaffection towards democratic structures in many European countries. As I already mentioned, our findings suggest that serious challenges lie ahead in terms of implementing the principles and rights of the European of social rights across Europe. We strongly believe that liberalization and privatization education have negatively affected teachers' professional autonomy. New public management inspired reforms in the form of teacher evaluation and consultation between schools and state authorities are either so recent of still being designed that it is difficult to predict the implications for teachers and other education personnel. It might lead to a reduction of professional autonomy, while the schemes of individual evaluation of teachers could be reinforce the power of employers and the precarity of teacher employment, in particular of teachers in the early years of career whose employment is already precarious. So from my side, that's all for right now.
Thank you.
I will just stop the share the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. I think it helps indeed zooming out a bit and looking at the structural issues that are there and that also influence assessment, but not only when it comes to education policies and lifelong learning more in general. So thanks a lot for your presentation. Now we're gonna zoom in again a little bit, thanks to Matteo, who's gonna tell us more about the links between the commodification or privatization of education and assessment and well-being, but from the perspective of European Students' Union. Floor is yours, Matteo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you very much for this invitation. And we think that it's important to have such a discussion where all the actors from formal, non-formal, informal education discuss about assessment and discuss about the links that are there, considering also the different purposes of our different forms of education. My name is Matteo Vespa, I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the European Students' Union. The talk that I would like to do today is to have a bigger picture on how the structure of the finances, the financing and of education as a whole shapes also the environment on which teachers operate and the learning and teaching happen, and therefore the assessment happens. So the first thing that would be important to underline is a quite obvious one, but what commodification means. Commodification means creating markets where they were not. And the creation of markets, as it was said, depends on not only on the entrance of private actors in university, which is something that especially in the highest decision-making bodies is being pushed forth through different waves of reforms as of now in the European Union for higher education, but it also means putting the logic of markets, of targets, of goals, of achievement within education. This starts first of all with the issue of funding, especially in those contexts where there is a creation of competition, as it was said, between higher education institutions to have a limited source of funding. There is a very recent OECD report, very interesting, on how the, let's say, costs for higher education has increased over the years, but this has not been matched with a sufficient increase in public funds, and this has created several pitfalls, starting from the increase of students to teachers ratio, in the creation of more precarization for the working staff, especially on teachers, in the separation between several functions that are part of our, at least European way of doing higher education, which is the teaching side, learning teaching side, the research side together, and the creation and the increasing of managerialization of higher education leading positions. So more managers and less academics, let's say. So also the question of the academic community starts to be put into question. And this is linked, for instance, to the issue of funding, as it was said, not only on the issue of shrinking of funds, but also how the funds are distributed. And now in some countries, there has been in these 10 years, in many countries actually, a shift between, for instance, historical funds or input-based funds to output-based funds called performance-based funding. Now, without going too much into details of that, also there would be also the question whether it is possible to have an assessment of such a diverse thing as performance-based funding, but which in any case are a way for the governments to steer also the mission of higher education and of the different higher education institutions, the emphasis on the outcomes, without considering, as you were saying before, where the students are coming from, where the higher education situation is in the national context, the regional ones, etc. First of all, increases the competition between higher education. It can also, if not well designed, widen the gap between those higher education institutions that were already performing better and those that were not. It can also lead to feedback, let's say negative feedback, in the sense of where the weaknesses are just strengthened because of the diminishment of funds, or also they can make the higher education institution try to have shorter paths to reach that. So, for instance, if the issue is the outcome of how many students are living on-time education, then they try either to lower the, let's say, quality of the teacher or the exams, etc., or on the other hand, push out of higher education those that were not, let's say, social, that didn't have a social and economic background that made them be equipped by themselves or better by their family, their social context to higher education. And this is also linked to the issue of investments in funding. I will take the example of Next Generation EU, and also how it is not enough to say that we need more investment in education. In many countries, there has been also, in some countries, 10% of the Next Generation EU funds on education. The problem is that, and this is something that all of us can relate to, there has been a little to none consultation of civil society actors, and in some cases also of social actors like trade unions, on what these measures should be. And so we see, and we have seen in several countries, that the Next Generation EU funds are used as a way to push those reforms that were not done in the past, but were not in the past because there was an opposition by students and by teachers, and sometimes also higher education institutions themselves. So they can also be the, let's say, the threat that further investments, if they're not coupled with social dialogue and involvement of the stakeholders, students included in designing of the measures, can actually be used as a way to authoritatively impose reforms that, as is the wave, now actually increase commodification. Increase of commodification means several things. It means, as it is happening now, for instance, diminishing the role of stakeholders inside of the education, managerialization of the higher education leadership, more power for external forces, be they private actors, but also sometimes politics inside of the governance structures of higher education. And this leads, of course, to outcomes. And the outcome is, if I need to have, if I'm evaluated as an higher education institution based on outcomes, then I will also have, I will also put a certain pressure towards my teaching staff to achieve certain results. And this leads us to the issue that is for us the important one, which is the assessment method that we think, and in general, the learning teaching method that we think it is necessary, is a student-centered learning, which is quite close in the formal sector to what was said, for instance, the breakout room about biographical assessment and look at the journey, etc., etc. So having the student as a center, not only of the learning, but also of the assessment. So not having this final big exam, but for instance, having several assessments during the period of the course, for instance. It means more more formative than summative assessments. And even if we know that the summative assessment is one of the key tools to eventually recognize the performance. And again, we talk about the commodified term of the students at the end of the course. Also, that depends on also how it is shaped. For instance, the impact on well-being of assessment on students is linked to the fact that assessment is not just failing or not with the exams, but also on the consequence that it has, not only the social ones, especially in those cases where there is a high competition between students, which eliminate the fabric of student solidarity and of academic solidarity, but also to financial consequences. There are, in some cases, the bulk of shaped examinations where it is not based on how a person went, let's say, compared to the learning outcomes, but based on the other's performance. In some cases, there are rewards or punishments if you are above the grade or below the grades. And also, if you fail an exam, then you have also financial punishments, for instance, towards tuition fees, etc., etc. And this is linked, of course, to the difficulties also in changing this kind of authoritative assessment, also commodified ones towards the student-centered learning. And this is why, for instance, the issue of teaching is important, because we think that in an academic community, teaching, learning, and research need to be put together. This, of course, depends on the different kind of fields. University of Applied Sciences, this means something else different from, let's say, research-based universities, but it's still there. And we think that this cannot be done if there is not enough emphasis on teaching and learning instead of research. Which is something that, for instance, was also recognized by their own 2020 ministerial communique of the European higher education area. But this doesn't mean that it is put into practice. And this cannot be done if there is not enough support for teachers and if there is not a better contribution in reshaping also the academic careers within higher education. That OECD report still states that there is an increase in the non-standard forms of work inside of higher education, also for the teaching staff. And this also leads to worse assessment of results of the learning outcomes for students. So this is why the European Student Union thinks that it is high time now, in a moment where we are coming outside of a decade of not sufficient investments in education, higher education, and in a moment where the next generation EU funds can either be used for good, or they can be used for actually to further commodify and precarize education, to have a united coalition of all the actors that are inside of higher education are working towards bettering the working conditions. So this is a call not only for us, but also to PhD students, to teachers unions, to staff representatives, to have a united coalition that should work at the European level, to work on those European pressures that Tomasz was telling before, that create a discrepancy between, on the one hand, the European Pillar of Social Rights, on the other hand, the commodification tendencies that sometimes are also supported by the Commission, and on the national level to create also national platforms that can empower each of the parts of the coalition to actually have a united voice vis-a-vis the governments and vis-a-vis the other actors, sometimes also vis-a-vis the national rectors conferences if needed, to better the situation. And we think that it is now the time to think about what are the financing structures, what are the working conditions inside of higher education for all the sectors of academic community, and only by doing that we can also work on reshaping the assessment and make it in a way that that we tackle the mental health crisis that now everyone is recognizing, both for students but also for the teaching staff. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. And indeed, we hope that opportunities and discussions like this can help strengthen it, if not building these sort of alliances. So thanks also for referring to this. We have a question from Rafaela from the audience. I think she wants to ask it herself. So I will let her do so. Thanks, Rafaela.
Thank you. Thank you. You probably have seen the question that I posted in the chat. It's whether you had the chance to take a closer look at EdTech funds, because you were talking about EdTech, but didn't go very much into detail. And I was wondering if you had the chance to have a look at the impact that they have on education businesses, as they call it, or education startups, but also the non-profits that they are funding. I'm asking particularly because I think it was 2 years ago or so that we were approached by one of our members from Eastern Europe. They had been approached by educaiton, which is a big edtech fund in France, and they were wondering, our members were wondering whether this was a reliable source of funding. We were a bit hesitant because, I mean, it's private funding and there is always a hidden agenda, in my opinion. I was wondering, have you had the chance to have a look at that? But also, I mean, what I find so striking about all these edtech funds is when you see their websites, they always claim that education brings so much profit that it's a real investment, and in the financial market it's really an investment, shareholders can make profit from that, while in the public education area it's still considered as something that is mainly generating costs and not an investment into the future. I know it's a complex question. It's probably going a bit too far off our topic, but yeah.
Maybe we can start. I think question was mainly for Andre and Tomas, right, Rafaela, if I remember correctly from the chat. I know Andre addressed this partially, at least in the policy paper, so we can start from there, and then I will give the floor to Tomas.
Sounds good. We it is a comprehensive topic and hard to be able to cover everything in this policy paper. So in terms of assessing the impact of this various strands of funding on different forms of organizations, it hasn't been done in our paper that comprehensively. But discussing, for example, with our partners from Poland that contributed to the focus groups, they actually receive most of their funding from private sources, for-profit organizations, and they rely on sometimes even on Google to deliver their programs, and they can be positive about it. But the reason why they are positive about this is because of how much there's an absence of funding coming from the side of the government, or how much the government is actually targeting certain education providers that would focus on sexual education or on global citizenship education. So then it becomes an alternative in this way for them, and the impact can be great, right, when you have no funding to rely on this. But as you said, there is a hidden agenda in the back of it. And then we looked into our research into the use now, pay later model. So at the end of the day, the impact is significant on all of these organizations from the perspective that you use resources to start learning how to use a certain platform, how to engage with it, to socialize your beneficiaries, your learners on how to operate with this platform. And then 3-4 years from then, it can become, you would have to pay for it. It would become, and then what do you do then? It's already entrenched in the organization. You're dependent on it, and actually, it's this type of model that sometimes these organizations come in and it appears as very benevolent in the way they're supporting. And without them, many learners wouldn't have had access to education, for sure. But at the same time, during the pandemic, I mean. But at the same time, there is this bill that will come later on this. And also in terms of paying with your own data, which happens, all of these edtech companies would be collecting the data, and you are not all of them disclose exactly how they are using it. So this is an issue. And in terms of the second part of the question about making profit out of education or being generating costs. It depends, because examples from our policy paper on why certain hedge funds would see education as an opportunity to invest can also be because you privatize education institutions that then they completely collapse at some point due to poor choices on the markets in terms of how these education institutions were bet on. And then overnight you have learners that no longer have an education institutions to go to. And this was the case in Sweden in our policy paper. So by all of their websites, when they say that so much profit can be generating, we can invest, it's probably also because they don't necessarily consider the fact that they should invest maybe into social cohesion gaps or social mobility rather than just short-term profit or profit for their own good. Not sure if I answered properly or if I got your point on this.
No, thank you so much. This is perfect.
Thank you. And Tomasz, would you like to add something on this?
Yes, I would like to add something very briefly. I think this is a very good question. So why private providers they see the profit, and public education authorities they just stress that this is only generating the costs. So I think the key, and I can describe this in the best way in the private-public fundings, especially. So I would just also present Polish case. So the problem is that there is a very thin border between high quality education and just taking the profits. So the problem is that when private providers they support, they present new technologies, and this is the value, and I think this is not a problem. But when they just make an impact for the autonomy, how the teachers should organize their work for the curriculum, this is what we cannot accept. And also, what I would like to stress, this is the creepy privatization. This is also the one of the problem which I think this is linked to your question. So especially in Eastern countries in Europe, there are the same fundings from typical public school and from schools which are still, you can say, public, but they're organized by foundations. So this is not the same conditions, and there is especially problem in that schools which this is not a typical private school, but I can say creepy privatization, that the working conditions for teachers, the workload, this is absolutely not the same, and also the quality is pretty low, and we have evidence for that. So I think that I add something to also answer Andrei. Thank you.
Thank you, Tomasz. And indeed, if you want to share also resources from ETUC in the chat, please do so, from past resources or studies that you also position papers, I'm sure participants will appreciate that. I see Matteo has raised his hand, but because we promised we would finish at around 12:30, I will give the floor to Isabel first for her question, and then I will give the floor to each of the panelists for answering Isabel's question, or commenting her remark, and for their main takeaways or concluding remarks. So Matteo, if you want to add on this question as well afterwards, I think it would be a perfect time. Thank you. Isabel, please.
It was not a question, it was some extra remarks, so I don't know if it is okay.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you for this exchange. And I keep in mind the remark and the definition of commodification with creating a market where there is not. And I have some extra remark about non-formal education. And it's true that there is a need of people who want to have some more education in order to give their children a good life for the future. And this is on this need that the commodification is built. And what we saw with our partners, and especially in Africa, it is that commodification is not really linked, well, is not necessarily linked with investment and financial investment, but with the captation of the public funds or the funds of the parents. And sometimes it can increase the quality because you can have a good quality product, but it is also a product, and some private school give a very good service and a very good product. And my remark was also about the conception of education we want to have in Europe. Is it a conception of education linked with the labor market? And the objective of education is to prepare people for labor market, or it is more linked with emancipation of citizen and build the citizen for the future? And I do the link also with the social rights pillar. And I agree with the position to link it with the social pillar, but in order to link it with citizenship and not only with employment and the labor market. And education should help people to do choice in their life and build the life they want, and not only to have good job for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I will give the floor to each speaker now. We will start maybe from Matteo, who didn't speak this last round. And if you want to, of course, also comment on Isabel's last remark, that's very welcome. Like Isabel knows very well, as far as SOIDER is concerned, this is definitely the understanding we want Europe to have about education, but happy to hear about other panelists as well. So Matteo, please, floor is yours. I would kindly ask you to speak for no longer than 3 minutes. So then we also have time for the concluding remarks by Giuseppina as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to comment on the issue that on commodification, creating a market where it's not. Unfortunately, as we know, everything can be marketized and everything can be a market. So it very much depends on the normative of what we want and the situation where we are now. Now we have continents where the private education is actually the majority of education, and this shapes also the discourse around education, also for public authorities. So in context, I think, for instance, the United States, but also on Asia, for instance, on Korea, etc., where higher education is actually a commodity because of, or Latin America, because of the majority, then also all the environment, it talks about that. And there are also, and in that case, for instance, students is seen as a consumer, and also the kind of initiatives that, and also all the surroundings on the relations between students, teachers, students and staff, students and management is based on that. There are also researches about the activism to better the conditions inside of higher education in this context, as based on the frame of consumers' rights more than of what we want on academic community. But that means that also in public, let's say in public funded education, this creates also what is the role that private actors look for. And this is, for instance, on the one hand, either they are like confessional schools, confessional education, even if in some cases, I think about Belgium, for instance, also confessional higher education institutions are considered as public, big changes. But it can also be either to give like easy degrees or to actually work on the issue of increasing the fees, etc., etc. So the main takeaway that I would say is that if we want to preserve education as a public good in Europe, we are first of all better suited than other continents because of the lion's share, let's say, that publicly provided, public funded education has. But on the one hand, that means that we need to make sure that this still remains the case, that we work on governments to avoid logics of like tuition fees, logic of marketization, and of increase of the share of private providers inside of higher education. And in order to do that, we need to have a united coalitions between all the actors of higher education and all the actors of education in general working towards this end.
Thanks a lot, Matteo. Andrew, you want to go next? And then we conclude with Tomasz.
That's great, because I was agreeing with Matteo very much on the last point about building up this coalition, this alliance, this support, so we can work together on this. And yeah, maybe linking it also with Tomasz's point about the pillar of social rights. It's I've referred more about maybe what at national level should be done in my presentation, in my talking, but at the same time, at EU level, though many times it's this argument that there's no competence in education or whatever. I think it's a great moment to look at the European semester, the country-specific recommendations that popped up in the semester for the past few years. They were mostly focused on education, as in education has the highest share of country-specific recommendations out of the others, but many times there were mentions to rein spending, austerity, caution, while at the same time you were asking to increase the access to education, to inclusion, and then this makes no sense. They are counteracting each other many times, and as Tomasz said, if we look at the pillar of social rights, it's time to actually also give relevance to social policy, not only to economic policy at the EU level. And then based on that, there's a message coming from the EU level, not for privatization, which basically would then embolden governments to meet the recommendations by doing more privatization, but rather they would realize then social policy is also important. We work on social policy as well. And it's a commitment that all of us should then fight for. So very happy about this opportunity for the alliances that Matteo was mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and I hope Tomasz is also going to collect this and welcome this opportunity for alliance. But I'll let you say it.
Yeah. So after when I just heard my colleagues and the summary, I can say that I fully agree that we have a problem how to speak about this issue, because I agree with Andre that when I am reading official papers like recommendation, if you are speaking about the European semester, I have the feeling that they just point out what different stakeholders they want to hear, but generally this is not a correct way in my opinion. So I will say very clearly that for us the European Pillar of Social Rights, this is the priority for the unions, and this is our aim, and this is, and we will always speak about the privatization from this perspective, but I am always open to hear other arguments and opinions. I think this is always very useful. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will now look forward to hear the main takeaways for Pina, President of the LLLP, and maybe potential ways forward for continuing this conversation as well. Thank you, Pina, for delivering also the concluding remarks. And let me say already, thank you all for participating in this debate and conversation. Floor is yours.
Okay, I have taken lots of notes, so I hope I'll manage to summarize a bit what has been discussed, but there's been so much going on that I'm sorry if I don't manage to really wrap everything up. I think the main takeaway of today is that education is a public good and it has to remain. So I think this is like, this I think we can all agree on. And I think to do that, we need to shift what the discussion, what I took from the discussion is that we really need to shift the narrative on the role of education and the access to education. So really moving the narrative there. And as it was said, right, I think, I don't remember who said it, but okay, about Isabel, about education creating much more than just taxpayers and labor force, but actually creating citizens. And so reversing the issue of the cost of education in terms of, we're not making money out of it, we're making a sustainable, fair, just society moving forward. I think we really need to be able to make this shift and promote this narrative further. And to do that, also the report mentions it in the European recommendations. We need to move to more transversal competencies and shifting the narrative at the Commission level, on the European level, on what is the main role of education. To do so, to also be able to promote education as a public good, we also need to be able to further promote co-management of education and the role of civil society and community in managing and governing education bodies and education institutions. And on this, we need to, yes, continue pushing for the role of social dialogue with structured social partners, but also be able to promote further involvement of civil society that is out of the structured consultation processes, just like us, some of us that are here now. To do this, of course, it is important to promote this change at the local level and to promote local change, but it has been discussed several times and everybody mentioned it. We need structural change and structural reforms in order to be able to achieve a real and long-term impact. And these structural reforms need to take into account and question themselves about what is the role of education, about changing the working conditions in education, stopping precariousness, and moving forward to putting education at the center of society and of budgets of every single member state of the European Union and beyond. To do this, they need to invest up a very generous portion of their GDP into education and lifelong learning, and more generally into creating active citizens. And this cannot be done without, and I think it was Andrei or Thomas who mentioned this, duality, quality, equality, that we need to take into account in promoting these structural reforms. Education cannot be based on competition among learners, among teachers, among education institutions. It has to be based on learning together, moving forward. And I think on this we can learn a lot from the non-formal sector. And we need to be able to promote also this, I call it this kind of, I don't know, mixture between the formal, the non-formal sector, where we can all learn from each other, particularly in promoting and revising governance structures, because civil society organizations have very good practices of governance structures that I think could apply potentially also to education institutions. We need to keep a particular lookout on the commodification of entitlements of lifelong learning, such as, for example, micro-credentials. I think Rafaela mentioned tech, but more generally, we need to particularly keep a lookout, for example, this is very dear to my heart, micro-credentials, and keep in mind that this represents a big challenge, particularly when it comes to governance and funding, and also the role of the private sector in this. And we need to continue pushing for continuous validation. But we also need to be able to take stock of what this means in a commodified education sector and environment, and so be able to have this discussion around all of these issues. Moving forward, I think it needs to be continuing to advocate, as we all do every day, for the continued involvement of civil society organizations in our specific sectors of learning, but also through the lifelong learning platform together. We will be promoting the recommendations of the policy paper further at every possibility that we have, and it would be it is always appreciated when there is a joint and mutual dissemination of these positions, because this gives us strength, the fact that we are part of a community and of a platform that reproduces our voice and impact. Other than this, I think we just have to keep on working in promoting these practices at the local level and sharing them with each other, particularly with those in the platform and outside of the platforms that work directly with education institutions and therefore can promote further change in that, and continue to advocate for non-formal education to be recognized as a very valid alternative and as also a very big sector of education which has incredible wealth of practices that could be reproduced into the other sectors of formal education. So having said this, I hope I was within time. I rushed, my notes have been all covered. But I would like to thank Elisa and Andre and all the panelists for being again here with us during the Lifelong Learning Week. This event was very fitting to the theme as all the rest of the ones. There is only some events left for the week. So if you still want to register, please do so. And please download also the position paper of the Lifelong Learning platform on the topic of rethinking assessment. I'm sure it will be an interesting read because you all seem very interested in the topic. So thank you very much again.
Thanks a lot, Tina, and thanks once again to all participants, and not least, of course, to the Secretariat of the LLLP for helping out, as always, with the organization of this event. So I hope you're going to have a nice day after this event, and we're going to keep discussing about alliance building and strengthening. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the snow for those of you who have it.
Yes.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.